So welcome to the Future of QMS Requirements True Quality Summit series. In this True Quality Summit series, we'll spend 2 days diving into the future of QMS requirements. We'll learn about upcoming deadlines, new changes, and what you can expect as you work towards world-class QMS. We have one of the most stacked speaker lineups we have ever had, so make sure to check out as many sessions as you can. At the end of this presentation, there'll be 10 to 15 minutes for questions. If any questions come up throughout the presentation, you can ask them in the Q&A tab, and we'll get to as many as possible. And with that, I will kick it over to Cisco to introduce himself.
Thank you, Brittany. Hopefully everybody can see and hear me. And I really appreciate the opportunity here to come and talk to you guys about our CSA guidance and what we really are trying to do with that. It's been something that has been in the works, and I'm sure ages ago we even did a presentation set here regarding the intent with that guidance, but it's finally been released. So we'll go through that, and if there's any questions at the end, I'm more than willing to take what I can, but also highlight it now, and I'll repeat it throughout the session. I do encourage people to take opportunity to review the guidance and comment, right? We want to make the product as usable and as good as possible on the release. So if there's suggestions, anything else, the comment period is up until November 14th, I believe. So feel free to go there and add any thoughts that you may have. All right, so as we get started on the discussion here, let's see if we've got this rolling. One of the things that I think we want to level set and just start out with is where we're going and why we're doing this. And you can see then why this plays a bit into that role. Part of the work we've had ongoing as a center for a while is really trying to rethink and transform where we want to be, not just as a regulator, but as kind of a partner within that collaborative ecosystem that is needed to improve safety and outcomes. Really trying to build out something that is a learning focused system, not just FDA, not just industry, but patients and providers, getting payers engaged in the process and the capability to really move the needle on that quality space. Let's see here. So, as part of that effort, we kicked off our Case for Quality activities because as we started engaging, talking to companies, really going out there and reaching out to stakeholders, we learned that there are bits and pieces of this whole puzzle that need to be moved individually, independently, in order to build out that broader learning system, right? So when we talk about a lot of the work that's been going on in Case for Quality, to seek to drive more efficient, high quality devices, we're looking to help drive a highly connected digital medical device ecosystem, increasing the flexibility for domestic production and medical device supply. This has been a big focus since the pandemic came out. From our standpoint at FDA, we want to increase the effectiveness of our resources and how do we make better decisions, but that takes data and information. And then the other piece of the puzzle is the patient provider piece, right? How do we arm them with that same information in order to be able to make more informed decisions? So we've got a variety of different things going on from our Case for Quality perspective, right? Our voluntary improvement program, our collaborative community, the medical device information and analysis sharing platform, really trying to get at that collective data across the ecosystem. And then our advanced manufacturing technology efforts, right? How do we build in or help facilitate organizations investing in these capabilities and these technologies as we move forward? There's a reason for all of that, right? A lot of the work that the agency is doing, and maybe you're aware of or not aware of, that's focused on, our Case for Quality efforts, our safe space, focusing on more product performance data. If you're aware of our software pre-certification program and the report that just came out, the faster signal detection method, the use of real world data and metrics, all of that is really heavily dependent on data, information, which in turn is heavily dependent on organizations being able to apply this type of automation and technology set within their production spaces or their manufacturing capabilities. This is a when we started this journey a while back and talked about getting to this information set, we really ran into the surprise that a lot of companies weren't in the boat of adopting these capabilities and technologies. And when we discussed it, the number one barrier at that point in time was computer system validation, right? The effort, the burden, the churn it often seemed to drive within an organization, which, as we thought about it in the very beginning, was never our intent. That wasn't what we were looking to drive. So just to be clear, good time to say it, FDA, because I've even had the questions even after the guidance was released. We do support technology and automation. We really want to encourage manufacturers to use these capabilities. They provide increased responsiveness, better control. They eliminate errors. From an organization standpoint, they bring value to the organization. The end result is a better product that is safer for the patients and users out there. And I think that's a benefit that outweighs what potentially might be any risk associated with using these systems in production or the quality system space. So let's talk a little bit about that computer software assurance and then the role it's playing. So when we talk about CSA, what it is, it's really just a description of a risk-based approach that can be used for establishing that the software you're going to use in production or the quality system is fit for its intended purpose. One of the things that I think is important to note in all that is when we talk about the idea of assurance versus the terminology validation, there was a reason for that shift in terms, and it was simply because we're talking about being able to focus on that confidence piece. Right? We're never going to get anything that's 100% perfect, but the higher the confidence level you've got that the system meets its intended use, the more flexibility you can really leverage in order to focus on how do I do this better? How do I do this faster? With the current state of technology and the way it changes, how do I maintain that it's still fit for its intended use in a more efficient and effective manner? The other piece of it that we wanted to make sure was included in the discussions throughout the guidance is the idea of the level of effort that's required to really create that portion of assurance and the record that needs to be maintained afterwards. I will say this, we've had some of our investigators say it. No one wants to go in there and look at binders and binders of technical details that were done. And oftentimes organizations put these together and really don't go back and use them again. We want the record to be something that is right-sized and usable for you as an organization. And if that's the case, then you can use that to demonstrate that the work you did establishes that fitness for use of the system. That's where we want us as regulators to also be and understand that discussion and not drive a lot more documentation or paperwork that isn't adding value to, I think, either part of that system. So one of the things that we want to talk about quickly when we talk about the principles of software validation and the computer software assurance piece, when we talk about what it means, no big secret, there really isn't a big shift or change in the methodology, the approach, what we're expecting. The foundational regulation hasn't changed. What we're looking to do is clarify in this sense, right, what it is that we were expecting with regards to that validation aspect of the reg. When we talk about assurance, you'll see that it's in the similar boat, right? This is not saying it's a completely different approach and that this is something we're going to now go out there and enforce to. This is guidance, not a regulation. The regulations haven't changed. What we are looking to do is provide flexibility in how organizations establish that, that confirmation, right? And objective evidence piece. there is value to the idea of the shift in thinking about the construct of assurance. As I mentioned, there's a lot of efforts and activities and external engagements that the FDA has been taking on, and they are dependent on information and data. So when we talk about this idea of enabling a more effective and efficient way of validating systems, it becomes a really foundational piece to any digital transformation effort in an organization. It also becomes a foundational piece to a lot of the work that we wanted to do as FDA. The intent is really to focus on more value, more understanding of what's happening in the system, more testing of what's relevant, less focus on the documentation that isn't driving value. And drive that idea of continuous improvement, we'll get into it down the road, but the support for a lot of these software services, these cloud activities, the cloud services where companies who that's what they live, that's their expertise, are building systems that you as an organization in the life sciences space can leverage and use. Because there is a safer and more effective cycle of development around that, there's got to be a way to maintain that the systems feel fit for its intended use without disrupting your operations, without disrupting what they do and the benefits that they bring. And that's the intent of what we're trying to get at with the guidance. Other piece of it, because this was something that was also new to me, is the cost of associated validation driven by the documentation efforts and the timelines, not necessarily because it was value add or more effective for establishing that the system worked. So part of the effort is helping drive value back into the process and the implementation of these capabilities. Improving the decision-making. Once you've got access to the data on either side, it makes for better decisions from an organization standpoint, faster decisions. It provides better information to share with us as an agency, which again, changes the way we view things on our side. And then the last piece is the intent of really improving that patient-provider experience. And while this isn't the final driver for it, this is the foundational piece, right? Getting more of these technologies in, and the guidance is intended to help facilitate that. So one notable, and just to get it really out there early on when we talk about the new draft guidance, we get a question again, oftentimes on scope, applicability, so on and so forth. I just wanted to draw attention to these couple of points and statements, right? The intent of the guidance, because this is where we heard the feedback that there was a lot of confusion. Once it's final, is really intended to really supersede Part 6 of the General Principles of Validation Guidance, which is about the approach towards these technologies used as part of production of the quality system. The other piece of that is a footnote that people just need to be aware of is we did work in development of this with our Center for Biologics, and in consultation, means they had feedback into the guidance. They had the opportunity to say yay or nay, buy into the concepts, and we adjusted along the way with our Center for Drugs, our Office of Combination Products, and our Office of Regulatory Affairs. So when we talk about the purpose of the draft CSA guidance, again, going back to the idea of what we want to do as an agency is really facilitate that automation and emerging technologies in leveraging more of those technologies in the medical device space. Want to move away from the mindset early on that is really focused on that documentation, keeping records just to demonstrate you're in compliance with the regs. The notion of validating everything, which is feedback we heard from a lot of manufacturers early on. A slow validation process, right? How do we make it faster and more effective? And the fact that everything started in the validation efforts from scratch. It doesn't matter what your supplier did, doesn't matter things you might have done already internally as an organization evaluating things. When it came time for the validation work, companies were starting everything from scratch again, all over across the spectrum. So moving over to the idea of CSA and the shift in terminology, it's to really focus on that higher confidence in the system and testing on that. Using risk to apply the right level of rigor and effort at the right stage, right? In order to make sure that you're looking at where the actual risk is that you're experiencing within the system or will experience if the system fails to perform as intended. Taking credit, right? There's a lot of work that the organization does in evaluating its suppliers and choosing a vendor, initial configurations, even other software testing work that gets done. Take credit for that. That all becomes part of the story towards your assurance or validation, determination at the end of the day. Other controls that the organization has, whether it is, decision-making, people controls, other testing downstream, all of that helps to mitigate and control where the risk gets introduced and should weigh on the level of effort to cover what's missing when you're thinking through your validation strategy. And then the final piece of all this is really about that agility and flexibility, right? We want organizations to really be more capable of moving quickly to respond and react to maintaining that software fitness for use. Big point again, overall goal, more testing, less documentation. It is a benefit these technologies really bring to patients, providers, it brings it to the organization. It really exceeds the potential risks that are oftentimes considered, and sometimes even the perceived risks, because they may not be connected to a patient issue. So a little bit about how the guidance is just broken out for people who've not seen it or are aware of it. So you can go back and kind of walk through and make appropriate comments along the way. We've got a few sections, our scope, where we're covering things, what it is that computer software assurance is in our interpretation, and then a proposed risk framework. Doesn't mean you have to do this exactly the way it's outlined there. It is just an example, right? Again, guidance is a recommendation. It is not a regulation. So we'll dive into a little bit of these elements now. Scope of the CSA guidance. We talk about what we're addressing within the guidance in the scope of products, devices, or just the regulations under 82070I, because that's where the construct and concept of validation really seems to show up for these spaces. It's when software for computers, automated systems that are used as part of production or the quality system. This includes design, development, manufacturing, even the quality system operations. It is not about IT infrastructure. It is not hardware. It is not general business operations. So as outlined beforehand, for this recommended approach, what we're talking about is kind of a tiered flow for how you think through the work that needs to be done, and how do you convey that story also to others, whether it's a regulator or auditing body or someone else within the organization even. Start with that identified intended use. That will allow you as an organization to determine, where is the risk actually being introduced, so you could figure out what the best approach is to assess and make sure that the system is fit for its intended use. Selecting and determining the appropriate assurance activities, right? What have you already done? What's in place? What are other controls? What's missing? And how do I best test for that? And then finally, establishing the appropriate record. Let's talk a little bit about each. So when we talk about identifying the intended use, one of the things that we wanted to make clear of within the guidance is this notion of whether or not the intended use of the system is, part of production directly, or the quality system, really directly applicable in the scope of the 82070I regulation. Is it a support tool? And these are testing tools, other scripting capabilities, just other things that maintain or collect data record or even test the system without being part of the actual quality system or production record. And then the idea of what's not used as part of production or the quality system. The other notable thing here to really keep in focus is the fact that in the guidance, we mentioned clearly that it doesn't mean an all or nothing approach with regards to the system, right? You may buy a system and use 50% of the features and not use the other 50%. One of the things that we'd heard early on was that companies usually validated everything, even if they weren't using it. I think it's important to consider the impact and connection of everything, but the intent here is to say, there's flexibility for you as an organization to validate only what's relevant and what's being applied and used. So when we talk about, software that's used directly as part of production or the quality system, we want it to be clear and just highlight some examples of what we think directly is or what is not. Not that it's all inclusive, but, and again, we're open to any feedback or comments on the space of what could be clarified here. But we're looking at, is it in production process? Are you using it for inspection, testing? These are areas that directly impact the product quality or could impact the medical device risk as it gets out the door. Software that's intended to be used to support production of the quality system. Again, talking about these development tools, monitoring tools, automating tools, general record keeping tools that are not part of the quality record. All of that from an agency standpoint, we consider lower risk. And we wanted to be clear about that right off the bat so that organizations knew where our thinking was early on and could put the effort where it was really relevant from their standpoint and our standpoint. Determine the risk-based approach. We've gotten a bit of early feedback on this concept, right? But part of what we wanted to do here is articulate clearly what we as an agency considered as a high-risk process, where we would be paying attention to the work that was done as an organization. And really anything else that was outside of that space, give you as an organization flexibility to determine what the right level of effort required would be. So that's why it sounds like this is a binary approach. Doesn't mean that it's the only way to do things, the right way to do things. I've seen companies use lots of tiers after that, but this was about clarifying from an FDA standpoint where our concerns were. So when we look at the high process risk areas, these are the ones that if the process fails and the system fails to perform as intended, impacts the process, it could lead to a compromised safety situation directly, which is where we kind of really term that the medical device risk. These are, as the example shows, software that maintain process parameters, things that could affect the physical properties. Anything that you as an organization would deem that's essential to that safety or quality of the product device that is now being controlled by the automation, that becomes a high process risk area. Everything else that we talk about that's not a high process risk area, even if it's impacting the quality system, the quality record, while I understand and a lot of organizations consider that to be a high risk, and it is notable that it's important to make sure you get that right from a data integrity standpoint, from the agency standpoint, but that isn't where we are going to put a lot of our focus and time or energy or expect the same rigor demonstrated. We are trying to allow flexibility for you as an organization to establish what's appropriate for your records and your space in that regard. Assurance activities. One of the things that we wanted to really provide some additional clarity on and enable some flexibility on here is, again, clarity on leveraging things that you already do as an organization or things that are already part of the broader quality system control aspect of things. Processes, the way they've been established, the people who are in the process or in review of certain outputs from the work being done, your purchasing control system, your process controls, anything that the data, anything that the software collects itself for monitoring, detecting issues, anomalies, maintaining its own quality record. Mentioned beforehand, these other validation tools, these external testing tools that can be utilized, and the idea of more iterative and continuous testing throughout the software lifecycle. All of these things are work that are done by an organization, they're done by your vendor suppliers that you can leverage to help maintain that story of the validated state or its fitness for use. Additionally, one of the things that we also want to provide clarity on is the notion that other testing methodologies that have been around for decades and are effective testing methods, such as unscripted testing. This includes the ad hoc, error guessing, exploratory testing. They are just as valid, and in some cases more valid than your typical robust scripted out test where every test case and process is identified line by line of what somebody must do. So there is clarity or the intent to clarify that these other mechanisms are recognized, they are valid, they're effective, and you as an organization can use them and determine which is going to get you the best result in a more efficient time frame. The notable here, because I get the question quite a bit, unscripted does not mean undocumented. I want to be very clear with that one. The unscripted does not mean undocumented. You will still have a output that meets the regulatory requirement, but the documentation isn't the focus, right? It's the testing and what was done. And in the guidance, there's some examples on what we mean by that. And then finally, it's the idea of the appropriate record, right? One of the things that we saw prior to this in practice a lot was just the development and generation of lots of volumes of testing protocols, testing data, outputs, screenshots, lots and lots of screenshots that were captured throughout the process that, again, question came back, is that really what's adding value? And if you as an organization had to figure out where something really went wrong or what was captured from a high level and why you did things, is that really where you go back and reference? Or do we really kind of go back to the very basics of what we were expecting as an organization or as a regulatory agency, right? It's, end of the day, you are the responsible party as the manufacturer of record, right? We need to know that you understand the intended use of that software, right? Whether it's broken down to feature, function, operation. You understood the risk. Where is the risk actually being introduced of that software and its failure to perform as intended? The assurance activities you might have done, and this does not have to be, again, a very exhaustive step-by-step list of everything that was done. It's testing that was conducted, depending on the type of assurance activity you thought was fit. If you found any issues, right, deviations, failures, and how you handle that, your disposition of those. A conclusion statement saying that the system was acceptable to you as an organization. Date was done, name of the person, and this is just, again, some examples of what would go in that record. And if by chance, depending on your processes, if you've established that there is a review and approval required, make sure that that gets captured and done within the record, because again, it's now what you've established as part of your process, and that's where you need to make sure you're consistent. Again, also noting not everything from an FDA standpoint requires a separate review and approval. Right? Very few of the regulatory requirements actually have that explicit piece of it, and those are the predicate rules that we often reference when we talk about the record. That being said, whenever we talk about the record, especially in electronic format, inevitably Part 11 comes up. I think this is an opportunity, and we talk about it a little bit in the guidance, to just highlight again, the Part 11 record regulations are under enforcement discretion for the validation of computerized systems. The intent there is, again, when we did that, was not to add anything additional or any additional burden that wasn't already covered by the requirement the regulatory requirement of a 2070I or covered in the general principles of software validation. So that narrows the scope of that Part 11 application and the records that it applies to. The other piece of that is even the guidance itself recommends considering and applying a risk-based approach to the validation activities of the parts of Part 11 that do apply, or if you as a manufacturer choose to validate certain things in accordance to Part 11. Just reminder that you can be more effective and efficient with that. What we're looking to do is just make sure you're not increasing the scope of Part 11 applicability, right? It doesn't apply to every record out there that you're generating or capturing with the system. Intent is really about ensuring that good data quality and data integrity piece of things. So keep that in focus when you're thinking through the application of that. And again, even in the guidance, as we said beforehand, the validation effort is commensurate with the risk. Within the scope of everything we've done with CSA and a lot of discussion that's happened in the last several years around it, we've tried to tell people a lot of this is not new. We've said this before, we're just now trying to make sure it's all in one spot or in one place so that it's a little bit clearer for everyone to really realize where the policy that we'd established was. So I think finally, just to summarize a lot of what we discussed here or where we're looking to do, I want to highlight some points that, again, it just bears hammering home. Guidance is not regulation, right? It is recommendations. There's no new regulatory requirements on this space. So remember that, when you're thinking through the application approach, this isn't something that now that it's released or when it becomes final, we're going to go out and send investigators to enforce to. Unscripted does not mean undocumented, right? There's always some documentation that's required, something that forms a record of what you did. There's some examples in the guidance, open to any input or feedback or comments on that piece. One of the things that always comes up inevitably in some of the discussions is the idea that when we talk about CSA and these systems either are low risk or not in scope, that we're telling organizations to not do anything about that. That is not what CSA means, right? At all. You as an organization will always do something to make sure that a product works. That's just good business practices. What we're saying with CSA is take credit for that work that you're already doing and do not add additional burden that isn't going to add value to what the product is doing or to you as an organization. We are planning, especially once the guidance becomes final, to incorporate some of this into our future training for our investigators. So, we're trying to, even within that space, have those discussions now, but the agency does have plans to really try to make this a bit more integrated and pervasive through our investigators. It does have broad agency support. Again, bringing back the note beforehand, because I will get this too. What about all these other centers? While it was developed and prepared by CDR agency, it wasn't in a vacuum on its own, right? We went through and did the consultations with CDR, OCPRA to make sure this was something that was acceptable from a concept to them and didn't conflict with any of the directions they were going or wanted to go. And I think finally to note, because we get the question a lot too about the idea of bringing this to the global regulatory market. When we really outlined this framework, it was already developed in a way that would have been, I guess, in alignment with a lot of the regulatory standards that are used. So there isn't a necessary conflict there. We've not gone out and talked about creating a global guidance or standard approach to this, because in our eye, it was originally already aligned with those expectations. Again, open to feedback and thoughts on that during the comment period here. But I want to note that companies both in the US and outside the US who have gone through inspections or their external audits, leveraging the approach, have had very successful engagements on it, and no one has really had an issue with regards to the methodology or the that framework that was outlined within the CSA guidance. So hopefully that's enough to get people thinking that, as we've established beforehand, this is already in policy. The regulations allow and have the flexibility to incorporate that into it. There may be some additional training that's needed down the road, but this is not something that is going to put organizations in some kind of regulatory jeopardy. And I think with that, Brittany, maybe we can open up and get into the questions and answers.
Yeah, sounds good. So we have some questions around the risk. And so one thing is somebody asked, what risk analysis tools does the FDA recommend to support the CSA approach?
What risk analysis tools does the FDA recommend? So one of the things that we've done or tried not to do in the guidance is to create and say, use this specific tool, right? The intent here is to get organizations to understand that the risks really they vary by context, right? Everybody seems to approach things very differently. They'll use an FMEA or some other things for the broader product of risk, and that's applicable there, right? It's a bigger area to really try to capture everything that you know on, because that impacts the patient directly. What we want to do here is to provide flexibility to organizations to think about what's the automation doing, right? And it's oftentimes not a risk that is, directly impacting the user or the patient. That's, from our standpoint, the highest concern area. Oftentimes the risk is this process piece will not function effectively, but I've got all these other tests down the road to capture that and make sure that any escapes aren't going to get out into the field. So it wasn't a question of saying you must use a specific tool or wanting to recommend that. On the contrary, what we're trying to do is get people to think through their software implementation and the impact of it, and understand that software isn't a probabilistic kind of failure system. It's either going to work, it's not going to work in that case. And what you're focused on is that element of the impact it's got on that process. Honestly, I want people to kind of be able to think through that and explain that a little clearer than to worry about using a formalized, kind of risk analysis or development tool, because the complexity that it adds into the whole cycle that we're trying to clean up increases like tenfold when you're looking at one of these additional process tools.
Awesome. So on that note, we have a couple questions about the high and low kind of risk levels. So we have a question here. Existing risk matrices in my organization use multiple levels, high, medium, low, and rank that 1 to 5. And then this guidance document talks about high and low, more a binary manner of risk. How do you suggest incorporating high and low risk from the guidance into a multi-tiered risk ranking system?
Yeah, so I think, you as an organization have got that, and that's very acceptable approach. It's a very common approach. The idea with the high risk and the not high risk, which is where we went to, is the focus, right? Putting focus for us as an agency on where we care about things. I think, in terms of an organization that uses a lot of tiers in their approach, which again, perfectly valid. Well, the ones that you rank out in the 4 or 5 level are probably the ones that we are going to pay more attention to. And what we're saying is everything else, you're free to rank it the way you feel is appropriate and your organization is comfortable with. So there shouldn't be a real need for you to change to anything within your process if that's working for you. It's just a matter of, when you're having the discussion, you need to explain things. Here's the ones that tie to that kind of high process risk area.
And so high level would be failure to perform as intended. Do, you know, do we need to be more detailed? Do you need to list all the ways that it fails or just the high
No,
level?
I think what we're looking to do again is it should be a high level discussion, right? If it fails to perform as intended, there is going to be an effect, right? You should be able to articulate that effect. If this fails to perform as intended, this process grinds to a halt, or this process completely deviates, but our statistical controls catch that and alert and alarm, right? That changes that risk dynamic. So when we talk about that portion of the high process risk, it's you being able to articulate what the impact is if that system fails to perform as intended. And, it could be an exceedingly high risk process and system. And if it fails to perform as intended, it immediately triggers an alarm. Again, that changes that whole paradigm of how much of a risk it presents to the patient. So that also enables you to have flexibility to say, okay, I can evaluate this a lot more effectively using some kind of unscripted testing, or I want to apply this in some other way to verify that it works, or it's going to work as intended consistently. The idea has always been, how do we make it more effective for an organization to test things out? And how do we stop kind of confounding the overall product risk and medical device risk to the patient with what's happening in these spaces where it's several times removed in a lot of cases. And, we can enable more efficiency, more effectiveness when we're just focused on what the impact is at that point in time, instead of confounding it all the way up to what it might lead to from a product standpoint.
Awesome. And then we have some questions around cybersecurity and what type of risk that would be considered.
Ooh, I think that would be up to you as an organization, how you're using the software, right? Cybersecurity is a concern. You've heard it. The agency's been doing a lot of work around that. But mostly from the bulk of it's been in the device side, right? We're talking about now the systems used in production or the quality system space to support. So, put into context that cybersecurity risk with what is the system doing? Where is it connected, right? How easy can it be accessed or, manipulated by someone internally or externally, right? For malicious intent. What are the organization's controls, right? Oftentimes there's a broader strategy around cybersecurity for the organization, the infrastructure it sets up around that, and how does the system kind of work and play with that. I would argue that it becomes something that you consider as part of the overall requirements that you use the system, and then figure out, is there any gap that isn't already covered or controlled with a lot of the work that's being done. We recognize a very important space. There is definitely risk. We've seen manufacturers get targeted and have issues from cybersecurity attack, but it should just be something that weighs in as your normal kind of operations process and evaluation. There shouldn't be a much bigger add-on for these tools, again, unless they are connected directly externally, and that's how you choose to implement them, and they do have an impact on patient safety.
And what would you say the best way to pilot this new guidance would be?
So there's a lot of organizations out there who've been successful just, crafting out a small, and again, I don't know if that's always necessary, but maybe it's how they've established their process to begin with, kind of a deviation set from their standard operating procedures for these things, and document what they're going to do, test it out with a system. Once that's done, I think it's very easy for them to identify what needs to change in the broader process, and then they just kind of go back and redo it. But even the regulations as they exist right now, they allow you to create these small deviations and test cases. I think leverage that system and process and test it out, try it with one system coming in, or upgrades that are coming for a system you may already have, and then decide, how did that work out? What needs to be changed? What more control do we need? And how do we then adopt, modify the broader SOPs we've got or processes we've established to account for a different approach?
Sorry, I was on mute. We have time for one more question. And that would be, how much can manufacturers leverage, information for the software assurance from their supplier?
So one of the things that we're trying to encourage is leveraging that level of work. There should be a lot that you as an organization can leverage, especially if it's a well-known product, a well-known supplier. They're willing to share bits of information with you. One thing to note, especially if you're implementing kind of these broader, bigger services or cloud solutions, you're probably never going to go in there and get an opportunity to audit them, right? So start thinking through other mechanisms that you can utilize to establish the control of what the interaction is with the supplier. When we look at the purchasing control regulations, all they state is that you as a supplier, as a manufacturer, are required to maintain a level of control over your suppliers. It doesn't say what that is. This is the opportunity to think through, okay, how do I evaluate them? What more do I need? Am I using it out of the box the way it's intended to? Am I configuring it differently than what's intended to? Am I customizing it in any way that changes the level of risk and the level of engagement or control you need to exercise with the supplier? But as much of what you can and they're willing to share, even the use of the SLAs, right, might be a mechanism for how that control is maintained and established, or communication that happens when changes occur. So we want to encourage a lot of leveraging of that information, because that's where a lot of technology is, right? It's really in that vendor space and their expertise. So use it, make the most of it. Don't go recreating a lot of the work that they've already done. In a lot of cases, I will always tell people, they are the experts in the software, not necessarily you. You need to be experts in that that product that you're providing to patients, and just to the overall health of the population. So worry about that. Leverage as much as you can from the ones who are the experts on the software piece.
Awesome. That's awesome. I'm glad that question was asked. But now we're at time. So thank you so much, Cisco, for being here. And thank you everyone for joining. We also have our 2023 State of the MedTech Industry Survey. So I popped that in the chat. Be sure to take that survey. And the next session will be starting shortly. And we'll be hearing about what's coming next with ISO 1345. So please hop on and join at the top of the hour. Thanks so much, Cisco.
No problem. Thank you.